Open up your Bibles, please, to Romans chapter 13. Romans chapter 13. I remind you that human history literally divides at the life of Jesus Christ. You know this. All history before Jesus is recorded as BC. What is that? Before Christ. And then history after his death is recorded as AD. That stands for Latin words there, but just after the birth of Christ. But Christ, as the dividing line, runs a lot deeper than that. You wonder, so what was the world like before Christ? And what has it been like since he was born? What happened, in other words, when Jesus' first followers heard him give them what is called the new commandment? Do you remember John 13? Jesus says, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another." So what was the world like before Jesus' followers heard and began to live out that new commandment? What was the world like? There was a great preacher back in England in the 1800s. He did a great job. It's kind of written in Old English, but he did a very good job of summing up. Here's what the world was like before Christ gave that new commandment. His name's Alexander McLaren, and here's what he said. When these words were spoken, the civilized Western world was cleft by great, deep gulfs of separation, like the crevices in a glacier, by the side of which our racial animosities and class differences are merely superficial cracks on the surface. Language, religion, national animosities, and differences of sex split the world up into alien fragments. A stranger and an enemy were expressed by the same word. The learned and the unlearned, the slave and his master, the barbarian and the Greek, the man and the woman stood on opposite sides of the gulf, flinging hostility across. McLaren really captured the world in all of its ugliness before Christ gave his new commandment to love. Well, then the years sped by. Very quickly, the gospel spread across the Mediterranean world, and the world literally began to witness something unheard of before Christ. McLaren describes what happened. Barbarian, Scythian, bond and free, male and female, Jew and Greek, learned and ignorant, clasped hands and sat at one table and felt themselves all one in Christ Jesus. They were ready to break all other bonds and to yield to the uniting forces that streamed from his cross. There had never been anything like it. It was only that the disciples were obeying the new commandment. And a new thing had come into the world, a community held together by love and not by geographical accidents or linguistic affinities or the iron fetters of the conqueror. So, all that to say, Christ's radical command to love, it just sparked this profound commitment among his followers, and the world could not help but take notice, couldn't help but believe it. And so our passage today in Romans 13, it is the Apostle Paul grabbing a hold of that and reiterating this same call to love our fellow man. So Paul outlines three specifics of this new commandment, of this call. And we're going to look at those today. He gives first the call to horizontal love. Horizontal love. He says in verse 8 of Romans 13, "Owe no one anything except to love each other. For the one who loves another has fulfilled the law." Horizontal love. It has to do with the Ten Commandments, which is why Paul speaks here of fulfilling the law. He's talking about the Ten Commandments. You might remember that the first four of the Ten Commandments deal with our vertical relationship with God himself. That's what they do. As in, you shall have no other gods before me. The final 6 commandments deal with our horizontal relationship with each other, as in, you shall not murder. Now, Paul just assumes that we naturally are working on our love for God. If you're a Christian, he just assumes you're working at trying to love God. Oh, but do we have a horizontal love for each other? You owe each other, he says, this ongoing debt. That's what he's saying. Origen was one of the earliest, what we call church fathers. He commented on this very command. I quote him, "We should both pay this debt and always owe it." In other words, no matter how much love you give, you are always in debt to love some more. You know, you can pay your debt to the bank, you can pay your debt to the store, you can pay your debt to the credit card company, but your debt to love your neighbor is never paid in full until you cross over into heaven. That's what he's saying here. And that really changes how you see people. You know, we all see people. We all have people say, life's good, except it wasn't for all the people. It changes how you see people. If you truly love your neighbor, you will not break these horizontal relational commands. Well, then Paul gives specific examples about these horizontal commandments. Verse 9, for the commandments, he's reaching into the 10, you shall not commit adultery. You shall not murder. You shall not steal. You shall not covet. And any other commandment are summed up in this word, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. So if you love your neighbor, you won't commit adultery with his or her spouse. Just that. If you love your neighbor, you will regard his or her life as sacred. If you love your neighbor, you will respect his or her ownership of their property. And Paul's unspoken point here is that you don't have a vertical love for God unless you love your neighbor. That's what he's saying. Your love for your neighbor, in other words, it's a whole lot more of an obvious measure of where you stand with God than it is how much you say you love God. You can tell people you love God you can tell yourself you love God. Really easy to convince ourselves we love God, but I'll tell you, if you really want to know if you love God, start looking horizontally. Do you love people? Because you and I can easily convince ourselves that we love God, but it is a whole lot harder to fool each other. You know if I love you or not. People know, we all know that. We're not fooled very easily. And so our love for others is a great measure of how much we really love God. That's what Paul's saying here. And he's also saying that when we begin to love other people horizontally, the way Jesus commanded, guess what happens? The world notices. It can't help but notice. It's what changed the world 2,000 years ago. It's because in this broken world, horizontal love, it stands out. And it stands out because we live in a very cold, uncaring world. I'll give you just one example. A young lady was assaulted on a highway in Chicago. A man purposely rammed his car into hers, and then he attacked her with a knife in her own car. He gets out of his car, into her car, attacks her with the knife. She had stopped to check the damage, right? So he rams into her on purpose, gets in her car, is assaulting her with a knife, and in her own car because she stopped to check out the damage. And as she struggled for her life on a busy highway in Chicago, she's struggling for her life. Nobody stops to help. Nobody stops to help. And she's still in her car. She manages to push on the gas pedal, and her car lurches forward, blocks an exit ramp. You can imagine that in a big, busy city. Blocks an exit ramp. People are literally driving around her while she's fighting for her life right there in full sight in that car, brutally attacked. Well, fortunately, her assailant falls from the car. She finds she's fighting, hits the gas again, and just speeds off, throws him from the car, and she escapes. So in the hospital, after a plastic surgeon had worked 6 hours on her face, just carved her up, over 100 stitches, her husband said, "This is what I can't believe. It's as if people went out of the way not to help her." Isn't that interesting? The police sergeant on the scene said, I quote, "The only ones who would have helped her would have been police officers if they had driven by." He says, and get this, people just don't help other people, unfortunately. Well, how accurate that is. People just don't help other people. There's the honest truth from a jaded police sergeant in Chicago, Illinois. And it's everywhere like that. His sad observation is generally true. But the point that I want to make from this admittedly extreme story is this: how irresistible Christianity would be if we Christians truly started to love our neighbors as ourselves. You see how different that would be if we loved our neighbors as ourselves? Seems like Jesus talked about that. Oh, he did talk about that. You remember in Luke 10, somebody had come up to him and Jesus says to that man, gives him a story. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. So you have to see this. This is a Jewish man living in Jerusalem. It's up in the mountains. And he's traveling down out of the mountains to Jericho. You might remember that famous story from Joshua and the battle, and the walls came tumbling down and all those things. Heather and I have made that journey. To this day, that is a journey through the mountainous country of Israel. That is a dangerous place to be back in those days. A lot of things can happen. A lot of robbers hiding behind those crevasses and all those twists and turns of that road. So a man is going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now, by chance, a priest. Now, we don't know what a priest is. That's a holy man back in Israel. A priest. I mean, if there's anybody that's going to help somebody, it should be a priest. Oh, but the priest is going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. It's like, come over here. Safer over here. So likewise, a Levite. You might not remember, but the Levites, of the 12 tribes of Israel, it's the tribe of Levi. Those are the holy men. Those are the people that worked at the temple and the tabernacle before that. These are the ministers. Surely a Levite's going to help him, but no, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, he passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan. Oh, wow, the hated Samaritans. Bunch of half-breeds. That's what the Jews felt like they were. Just got a little bit of Jewish blood running through. Oh, they're terrible, they're unclean, and they're savage. I mean, a Jew would not stoop down to even be close to a Samaritan. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine, and then he set him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, "Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I will repay you when I come back." And Jesus gets to the end of this story and he asks, which of these 3 do you think, remember he's talking to this man, which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among the robbers? And he said, the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said to him, "You go and do likewise." What's Jesus' point? He's talking about who's your neighbor. Based on that, who is your neighbor? Who's my neighbor? How about anyone? Anyone that God puts in our path, that's our neighbor. Therefore, Paul says, you shall not commit adultery. If you love your neighbor, you're not going to commit adultery, because adultery is hatred towards your neighbor. Adultery destroys families, friends. You shall not murder. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness. Now, we don't love our neighbor when we help ourselves to his possessions, right? We don't love our neighbor when we slander them. We don't love our neighbor when we poison other people against them. All those things violate the law of God. You shall not covet. If they're your neighbor, you don't covet. If you and I were kings of a new kingdom, and we had to establish 10 basic laws upon which to found our new nation, what laws would we include? Would we think to include a law against coveting, against covetousness? Would we? Well, God did. What? Because God knows what happens when somebody is jealous of somebody else. God knows the destruction that envy can bring about. I think a lot of us have felt the impulse to steal something. Maybe when we were kids, like we saw something our friend had, it's going to want that. We understand that. It's just an impulse to have what they have. I've felt that. I think most of us have felt that desire to possess the stolen impulse. The stolen item. We can understand that impulse, but I think it is entirely something else to say, but if I can't have it, you can't have it either. If I can't have it, well, by golly, nobody can have it. You see, that's veering towards hatred of your neighbor. And that's why vandalism, it's interesting, vandalism is one of the worst things that can ever happen in a society, they have learned. Frankly, I think it's one of the reasons America is falling apart. Do we have vandalism? I invite you to drive under any bridge in Tulsa. What do you see? Vandalism, graffiti, Vandalism has always, they've learned, it's one of the worst forms of envy and covetousness and therefore hatred of your neighbor. And if I was king for a day, I would elevate, on the city law books in Tulsa, I would elevate vandalism as one of the stiffest things. We've learned about the sword of the government going after the bad guy. I would rank vandalism way up at the top. And it's because vandalism at its root is hatred towards people, which is far worse than just stealing in any case. Well, we've seen so far, Paul's just his first call is a call to horizontal love. But this wasn't just a casual matter for Paul. In fact, he sees it as urgent. So secondly, he issues the urgent call to horizontal love. He writes in verse 11, besides this, you know the time, that the hour has come for you to wake up from sleep. For salvation is nearer to us now than when we first believed. The night is far gone, the day is at hand. What do his words there make you think of? He speaks of the time, the hour, the night has far gone, the day is at hand. He's talking about the end of the world. He's talking about the end of time. He is saying that the second coming of Jesus Christ is imminent. It might be tomorrow. And he's saying that imminency of the end of the world demands that we live and love a certain way. So our very own Kaylee is pregnant with child. There's Kaylee. I've brought you up a couple of times lately. I'm trying to help your baby out. I remember how excited our family was almost 9 months ago. We learned that Eli and Kaylee were giving birth to a little baby girl. We in the Ragsdale clan, who have a lot of boys, were excited, for a little baby girl, another one. 9 months. Nobody needs to tell Kaylee that 9 months is a long time. 9 months ago, Kaylee, let me remind you, that was late summer. Kaylee was excited back then, but I don't think she expected her little baby to come in September or October, did she? Kaylee went through the entire winter season pregnant, and she was excited all through the winter too. She didn't expect that little baby to arrive in February, March, or anything. But I want to tell you, now, everything's changed, because that little baby's due date is pregnantly upon us. That little baby, Ragsdale, could come at any time. I'll bet Kaylee has an overnight bag packed. I'll bet Kaylee is wishing and praying that Eli can break the traffic laws of the city of Tulsa and speed to St. Francis Hospital and get that baby out of her tummy. It's time. I doubt Eli and Kaylee have vacation plans to go several states away starting tomorrow, do they? No! Because the arrival of their baby is imminent. And think about that. The imminency has a direct effect on their lives right now. That's what Paul is saying to us right now. He's saying the looming end of time, it places on us this urgent call to love horizontally. He's saying it's time, right? It's time. Love like the end is tomorrow. That's what he's saying. If you talk to somebody on their deathbed, you will never hear, I'm a preacher, you never hear people who know they're facing death. You'll never hear them say things like, I just wish I'd have spent a little bit more time at the office. I wish I'd have earned a little bit more money. I wish I'd have been a little more successful. I wish I'd worked out more at the gym and had bigger biceps, tighter buns. I wish. You never do you hear that kind of stuff. When people are staring their own death in the face, they talk about things that matter. It is always their family and their eternity. That's the only thing they want to talk about. And what Paul is doing right here, he is dragging each of us right up to the final day on planet Earth. And he's got us right there. We're at the very end of it all. He's saying, can you not see there's no tomorrow here? You're at the end. There's no tomorrow. And he said, so now, can you see that? So now, live and love urgently, like there's no tomorrow. Like you will see Jesus tomorrow. That's what he's saying. I think many of us need to read that, hear that, and kind of wake up from our spiritual lethargy. We're anemic. Like so many of us have just lost any passion for following these things. We fool ourselves and say, but I love God. And God just said, let's turn that horizontally. Do you really? Look at yourself. Look at how you're loving. Do you really say you love me? You don't love me if you can't love like that. I think many of us need to start loving that way. Many of us, we really need to be like the little boy. His clock broke and it struck 15 times. It's like counted them. 1, got past 12, it's like 13, 14, 15 times. And man, he ran into the kitchen where his mom was and he's like, Mommy, it's later than it has ever been before. Like 15 o'clock. Do you get that? That's a pretty good wisdom. It's never been 15 o'clock on the face of God's green earth. And I'll just be honest. Jesus Christ might not return during our time He might not, but I tell you, he is certainly going to come for every single one of us in death. I promise you that. Think about it. Every ache you feel in your body, don't start raising your hands. Every pain, every gray hair. How about hairs that turn loose? I used to joke. I remember one time my goofy cousin asked me one time, she hadn't seen me in a while because she lived out of state. I had long since gone bald and kind of gray. And she said, Todd, do you color your hair? I'm like, color my hair? Are you kidding? If I was going to pick a color, it wouldn't be gray, And have you not noticed I'm bald, It was kind of funny anyway. Every ache, every pain, I'm saying, every gray hair, every new wrinkle, every funeral you go to is a reminder that it is later than it has ever been before for you. It's just about 15 o'clock for some of us. It's later than it's ever been. Paul's saying it's time. Right now, it's time for all of us to start loving our neighbors as ourselves. Well, third and finally, Paul gives us the specifics of the urgent call to horizontal love. He says in verse 12, so then, let us cast off the works of darkness and put on the armor of light. We got to put off something, and we got to put on something if we're going to urgently love one another. And Paul gets specific about the works of darkness that we are to put off and discard. Verse 13, let us walk properly as in the daytime, not in orgies and drunkenness, not in sexual immorality and sensuality, not in quarreling and jealousy. His references here pertain to these pagan religious practices that went on in the ancient world that honored and worshiped the god Bacchus. Bacchus was the god of the grape and the vine. And Bacchus was the sponsor of ancient Bacchanalia. And that was this orgiastic feast that involved gluttony and unbridled sexual behavior. And so what would happen is the participants ahead of time, they would set out to get themselves so slop drunk, so drunk, so that it would just silence any pangs of conscience that they might have, so that they can just engage in unbridled sin. And so it's against that backdrop that Paul says, first, there must be no orgies and drunkenness. And he strings those words together to just literally picture these drunken people who are living what they believe in the moment is the high life. I mean, unbounded pleasure and joy. It's the wild high life. I grew up as a fan of rock and roll. So years later, I enjoyed watching these documentaries about some of those famous rock bands, right, of my youth. And the story was funny as I watched all these documentaries. The storyline from band to band was almost identical every time. They all started out dirt poor. We're just playing in somebody's basement, playing in somebody's parents', garage or whatever. Oh, then we got our first break and we hit it big. And then came stardom and wild partying, orgies and drunkenness, to use Paul's phrase. And then came drug addiction. And then came ruining their lives, ruining their marriages, ruining their kids' lives. And now years later, they've got themselves cleaned up. And it's crazy. From band to band, they all feel this massive regret for hurting those people they love in the past. Well, we Christians better heed the warning of all people of the aging rock stars. They are talking to all of us like, don't fall for that. Just because your flesh desires something in the moment, you can't do that. We're called to urgently love. We who are called to urgently love, we've got to avoid pursuing these destructive pleasures that the world out there is falling into. Second, there is to be no sexual immorality and sensuality. That Greek word rendered sensuality is one of the ugliest words in the Greek language. It describes someone, they're not only given over, just jumped whole hog into sexual immorality, but they are incapable of feeling shame. Shame's interesting. Shame is almost totally absent from American culture. The sexual revolution just swept through and it kind of washed away any sense of shame. And in the aftermath, you noticed our society is literally drowning in sexuality, sensuality. Have you noticed that just like innuendo has invaded our common speech? I mean, you can barely say a word anymore without people giggling and winking at each other. I just used a word. Our entertainment is raunchy. You talk about how depraved we are, how sensual. We dress up our little girls like harlots. We teach those little girls to wiggle their hips seductively, and we call it a dance team. We'll have contests, and we'll travel around. Little old girls that don't even know what the heck they're doing, and mom and dad are dressing them up with the paint in their little faces. Super Bowl halftime shows are so R-rated that modest families have to turn the channel till the third quarter starts. We Christians who are called to urgently love our neighbors, because the end might be right here, but we certainly can't engage in that immorality and sensuality. And if we truly love people, we literally have to back so far away from that sexual cesspool, and we have to advocate for, frankly, a cleaner society that's safer for people because we love them. The third specific is to abstain from quarreling and jealousy. And that phrase really describes someone who can't stand being surpassed or bettered. They always grudge other people their success and their position. And I'll tell you, the way that usually plays out in the life of a church is somebody kind of acts like some really holier than thou Christian. They act like it's their holy duty to keep everybody else in place. Anybody remember the church lady? I'm really going back. We did the rock bands from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Remember in the church lady on Saturday Night Live? They're kind of like that. Oh, they're judgmental, and they're the first to stir up a stink when somebody else is doing something wrong. But it's interesting, just beneath the surface, usually their behavior traces back to the simple fact, you're jealous of them. Oh, you're just jealous of them. They can't stand it that somebody is better than them, more popular, more successful, more whatever, and so they'll stir up something against them. Well, that kind of behavior can never exist in a heart that truly loves other people. You get the sense as you read Paul's examples here that there's much in us that must go. We got to put it off, take it off, discard. There's a lot that's got to go if we're going to urgently love people, because the time might be upon us. It might be later than it has ever been. How do we know that it is not 15 o'clock on God's clock? But you know, there's a glorious positive side to all of this. Verse 14, Paul says, put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh to gratify its desires. When Paul says put on Christ, here he's just talking about practical, just day to day, repetitively put on Jesus Christ. Embrace Jesus again and again and again. I like the way Ray Stedman illustrates this. I quote, he said, when I get up in the morning, I put on my clothes, intending them to be a part of me all day, to go where I go and do what I do. They cover me and make me presentable to others. That is the purpose of clothes. In the same way, he says, the apostle is saying to us, put on Jesus Christ when you get up in the morning. Make him a part of your life that day. Intend that he go with you everywhere you go, and that he act through you in everything you do. Call upon his resources. Live your life in Christ. I like that. So Paul is saying, urgently loving people comes from the negative, putting off the works of darkness, but also the positive, putting on Jesus Christ every day. And we have to constantly do that. How do you do that? How do we pull that off, sinners that we are? Well, the only way that we can love God and love other people is because why? Oh, because God first loved us. Never forget 1 John 4:19. It says, we love because he first loved us. That's how we can do it. It's the only reason we can do it. God's love reaches down through us. It came through Jesus Christ. It exploded into our hearts through the Holy Spirit. And then when all that's said and done, well, we just return that love back to God and then horizontally to other people. That's the principle. And it's interesting. I read this week. That principle was, I think, dramatically illustrated in a woman's life. Her name was Catherine Laws. Not well known at all. Her husband, Lewis Laws, he became the warden a long time ago. Anybody heard of the old famous prison, Sing Sing prison? It's way back in the day. And when he became the warden at Sing Sing prison, the inmates there lived in just wretched conditions. But he was really motivated by his wife, Catherine. And based on that, he introduced humanitarian reforms in that prison. She always treated the prisoners there as human, beings. Yes, they had broken the law, some of them terribly. And yet they were human beings in her eyes. And she felt the call as a Christian to just love them. She'd bring their 3 little kids sometimes into the prison. And they would have baseball games and things like that, basketball games for the prisoners. And she'd sit right there with her kids, letting them get to know them by name with murderers and thieves and all kinds of things, gangsters. Well, 1937 rolls around and Catherine is tragically killed in a car wreck. Dead. And the very next day, her body is laying in a casket in a house just about a quarter of a mile down from the prison there. And so the assistant warden, he's on charge, and that very morning he sees hundreds of prisoners. They're all crowded around the main entrance, and he knows exactly what they want. There's her body, just a quarter. You can see the house down there. He knows exactly what they want. He literally opens the gate, and he says, "Man, I'm going to trust you. You can go pay your respects to Catherine." Didn't take account, didn't post any guards, none of that. Not one man was missing that night when they took the count, when they came back. Now think about that. Love for one who had loved them. It made them dependable. Isn't that something? That's why they did that. These are not trustworthy men in any form or fashion. But love from Catherine for them made them dependable. And isn't that something? And I tell you, that should be infinitely more true in relation to God's love for and through us. God sacrificed himself for you. God lavished his love on you and me. That ought to make us the most dependable people in the world. And I don't mean just in terms of doing right and wrong. We're talking about being dependable in our showing love to the world around us. That's it. That ought to be that way. How wonderful it would be if the majority of us in this very church, the majority of Christians in the church in America, could just start doing this. And I say literally, God help us cultivate a sense of debt, love debt. You ever owe somebody money, then you bump into them on the street, and you just like the first thing that comes to your mind is the money you owe them? You know, that's what ought to happen. We should live with that sense of love debt. When we see somebody and God puts them in our path, the first thing that ought to cross our mind is, how can I show some love to them? God help us enlarge our definition of neighbors so that my neighbor isn't just somebody like me, somebody I'm around, somebody I like naturally. No, it is any person who God puts in my way that I could help. God help us cultivate a sense of time. It is later than it has ever been before. It's 15 o'clock. Christ might come tomorrow. And then finally, God help us consciously put off the works of darkness and put on Jesus Christ every day, again and again. Would you please stand to your feet, bow your heads, and close your eyes as we pray.